My name is Claire Bennett, and I am 30 years old. Looking back now, I can trace the beginning of my story to a pattern that repeated itself every summer for nearly a decade. As soon as school closed in June, my parents would drive me to my Aunt Margaret's bookstore, where I stayed until the end of August. Meanwhile, they traveled with my younger brother, Lucas, on what my mother proudly called our family's annual vacation. Year after year, the routine never changed. Each summer left behind another postcard. Each postcard carried another reminder of where I truly belonged in their eyes. By the afternoon I graduated from high school, I had already decided my future. My belongings were packed before the ceremony even ended. That same night, I crossed the state line and began a completely different life without telling anyone where I was going. My parents searched for me for 5 years. When they finally located me, it wasn't in the town where I had grown up. They found me inside the bakery I had built from nothing, almost 1,900 miles away from Indiana. My mother slowly surveyed the room, the customers chatting, the shelves lined with fresh bread, the business I had created without her help. Then she spoke. Her opening words made one thing painfully clear. She hadn't come because she regretted the past. She believed there was something she still had the right to claim. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, a place where people who spent years staying silent finally share the moments that changed their lives. If stories about complicated families, personal boundaries, and finding a fresh beginning speak to you, leave a comment and subscribe. To understand how everything unraveled, we have to return to the summer I was 9 years old, when one ordinary piece of luggage quietly became the symbol of everything that followed. It appeared in my bedroom on the final day of 3rd grade. It was a sturdy crimson suitcase, polished until it gleamed, with smooth wheels and a handle that clicked into place. My mother placed it in front of me with the excitement of someone revealing a wonderful surprise. "You finally have luggage of your own," she said, wearing the carefully practiced smile everyone admired on Sunday mornings. At 9 years old, I couldn't imagine any reason to own a suitcase except for a vacation. The year before, my brother had boarded a plane for an unforgettable holiday, so naturally I believed my turn had finally arrived. I couldn't have been more mistaken. 2 mornings later, we left home before sunrise and spent almost 6 hours driving west to the small lakeside community of Pine Harbor, Minnesota, where my Aunt Margaret lived above her cozy bookstore. The building always carried the comforting scent of old pages, cinnamon, and fresh coffee. My parents shared a quick meal with her before getting ready to leave. My father carried my suitcase inside without saying much. Then my mother bent down until we were face to face. She quietly repeated a sentence that would echo through every remaining year of my childhood. "Good girls know how to be brave." She kissed my forehead, climbed back into the car, and disappeared down the road with Lucas happily waving from the back seat as they continued toward the airport for their trip to Hawaii. I remained standing on the porch until their car vanished. I didn't cry. I didn't beg them to stay. I had already learned that silence earned more approval than tears ever would. Only as an adult did I realize how heartbreaking that was. There is one detail I couldn't admit for many years. Their vacation had been planned long before I knew anything about it. My suitcase wasn't purchased at the last minute either. Everything had been arranged weeks in advance. The only part delayed was telling me. That meant the decision to leave me behind had already been made while I was still counting down the days, believing I was going to. People sometimes ask why I disappeared from my family without arguments, announcements, or dramatic goodbyes. The answer is simple. Careful exits were something my mother taught me herself. She just never imagined I would eventually use that lesson on her. Every June, the routine repeated itself almost perfectly. The suitcase went into the trunk. We made the familiar drive to Aunt Margaret's bookstore. We shared lunch. Then the car left with one empty seat where I should have been. A few weeks later, another postcard would appear in the mailbox. The destinations changed every year. Honolulu, Yosemite, Santa Fe, Boston, Glacier National Park. The handwriting was always my mother's. So was the closing sentence. "Wish you were here." Aunt Margaret never commented when she handed me each postcard. Later, I often noticed her placing them inside a worn wooden box she kept hidden on the highest pantry shelf, almost as if she believed one day those small pieces of cardboard might explain everything. I read every postcard so many times that I nearly memorized them. For years, I searched them for proof that I mattered. Eventually, I understood what had been missing all along. There was never a single sentence saying they missed me. There was never an invitation promising I would join them the following year. Those postcards were never written to comfort me. They existed only to document a family memory that had been created without me. When September arrived, every student in Pennsylvania was assigned the same familiar classroom essay, How I Spent My Summer Vacation. I always wrote about the weeks I spent helping Aunt Margaret in her little bookstore by the lake. The paper usually earned an average grade, and when I brought it home, my mother proudly taped it to the refrigerator. Right beside it sat a glossy photograph of Lucas grinning from a parasail over the ocean. Two memories from the same summer. One family. Two completely different childhoods. By the time I reached middle school, I stopped telling the truth in those essays. Instead, I invented adventures that sounded more like everyone else's vacations. No teacher questioned the stories. More importantly, no one in my family noticed I'd stopped writing about my real summers. That silence revealed more than any postcard ever had. At the time, I thought those postcards were nothing more than small reminders that I had been left behind. I had no idea they would eventually become some of the most important pieces of evidence I would ever possess. To understand my parents fairly, and I've spent many years trying to judge them with honesty instead of bitterness, you have to go back much further than the first summer they left me behind. Everything really began inside a children's hospital. When Lucas was 5, doctors discovered he had lymphoma. I was only 3, far too young to remember the diagnosis itself. Even so, I grew up living in the shadow it cast over our family. For several years, our lives revolved around treatment schedules, specialists, charity events, and endless hospital visits. Our church organized fundraisers. Neighbors filled our freezer with homemade dinners. My mother spent countless nights asleep in an uncomfortable chair beside my brother's bed, while my father worked every overtime shift he could find to keep our medical insurance active. Little by little, our family rearranged itself around one single priority. Everything pointed toward Lucas. Looking back, I understand why. When a family believes it might lose a child, every decision naturally circles around keeping that child alive. Eventually, the treatments worked. In 2006, Lucas rang the hospital's celebration bell. There were balloons, photographs, tears. That framed picture still hangs in my parents' hallway today. He was 9. I was 7. Most people would assume that was the moment our family could finally breathe again. Instead, it became the blueprint for everything that followed. My parents promised themselves they would give Lucas every experience they had feared he might never have. It was a promise born from love. Unfortunately, another belief quietly grew beside it. Claire is healthy. Claire is independent. Claire will be fine without us. That assumption settled into our family so deeply that no one ever questioned it again. Here's what matters most. The summers without me didn't happen while my brother was fighting cancer. They began years after he had recovered. The crisis had ended. The habits it created never did. No one stopped to ask whether the rules that existed during those frightening hospital years still made sense. They simply became the way our family operated. When I turned 11, I finally gathered enough courage to ask if I could come. That year's destination was Yellowstone National Park, and I wanted to see it more than anything I had ever wanted. I prepared for the conversation as carefully as if it were a school presentation. My suitcase was packed days ahead of time. I even wrote a handwritten page listing every reason I thought I deserved to go. At the top of the page, I proudly wrote that I wanted to see geysers with my own eyes because I had only read about them in books. I rehearsed my speech over and over in front of my bedroom mirror until I thought I had every sentence exactly right. Finally, one evening I walked into the kitchen holding my list. My mother was drying the dinner plates. My father stood near the back door absent-mindedly twirling his car keys. I explained every reason I could think of. When I finished, my mother quietly set the towel aside. She walked over, bent down until we were looking directly at one another, and answered with the same gentle voice she always used when she believed disappointment would hurt less if it sounded kind. "This vacation is something your brother has been looking forward to," she said softly. "After everything he survived, he deserves this time." I felt my face tighten as tears threatened to appear. Before a single one escaped, she smoothed my hair away from my forehead and repeated the sentence that had become the unofficial rule of our household. "You're a brave girl. Brave girls don't complain." My father remained completely silent. That was his contribution. Not anger, not agreement, simply silence. I folded the list back into my pocket, returned to my bedroom, and closed the door without another word. A few minutes later, I heard the dishwasher begin its cycle. The television filled the living room with laughter. Conversations carried on as if nothing important had happened. The house continued with its evening. Only I understood that another decision had already been made without me. There is one memory that has never faded, no matter how many years have passed. That evening, sometime after dinner, I heard the soft clicking of suitcase wheels rolling across the wooden floor downstairs. Curious, I stepped out of my bedroom and leaned over the upstairs railing. There it was, the crimson suitcase, standing neatly beside the front door. Closed, tagged, ready to leave before sunrise. I hadn't packed a single thing. In that moment, something became painfully obvious. My parents had already decided where I belonged long before I stood in the kitchen asking to join them. My carefully rehearsed speech had never stood a chance. The answer had existed before I ever opened my mouth. After that summer, I never asked again. Not because I stopped wanting to go, because I finally understood that my opinion wasn't part of the decision. If this story were only about being left behind every June, it would be much easier to tell. But life has a strange way of mixing kindness into heartbreak. The place I was sent each summer eventually became the only place where I truly felt seen. At Aunt Margaret's little bookstore near Silver Lake, no one treated me like the child who required the least attention. No one expected me to disappear quietly into the background. There, I wasn't the easy daughter. I wasn't the healthy child. I was simply Claire. Margaret was my mother's older sister. She had lost her husband while she was still young and never had children of her own. After decades of running the town's bookstore, she knew nearly everyone by name and believed every child should learn how to be useful. The very first summer I stayed with her, she handed me real responsibilities. Not pretend chores to keep me busy. Actual work. Sorting deliveries. Counting inventory. Wrapping purchases. Helping customers find books. When I was 10, she taught me how to repair old hardcovers with glue, cloth, and patience. She stood beside me as I worked, gently correcting my hands whenever I rushed. "Books forgive mistakes," she'd tell me. "People usually do too if you give them time." Whenever I damaged a spine or glued a page crooked, she never scolded me. Instead, she'd slide the book back across the table and ask, "Tell me what happened." She wanted me to think, not guess. Then we'd start over together. At her shop, my opinions mattered. She asked which display belonged in the front window, which flowers should go beside the entrance, which movie we should rent on Friday evenings. Simple questions, but every answer changed something. I still remember overhearing her introduce me to one of her regular customers. "This is my summer kid," she said with a smile. Those 4 words stayed with me for days. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. The summer I turned 12, we were eating homemade blackberry cobbler when she looked at me for a long time without saying anything. Finally, she smiled. "In this house," she said quietly, "you're allowed to be exactly who you are." She paused as though another sentence was waiting to be spoken. Instead, she reached for my glass and asked whether I wanted more lemonade. That happened often. She would begin to reveal something important, then stop herself before the words escaped. Looking back, it felt as though she carried secrets she desperately wanted to share but believed weren't hers to tell. When I was 13, I accidentally discovered what those unfinished conversations had been hiding. One autumn night, I woke up thirsty and headed downstairs. The kitchen light was still on. Margaret sat alone at the table with the telephone pressed tightly against her ear. I stopped before entering because I'd never heard her voice sound like that. It wasn't angry. It sounded desperate. Then let her live here, she pleaded, just for one school year. She was speaking to my mother, Susan. Silence followed. The house became so quiet I could hear the wind rustling the trees outside. When Margaret finally spoke again, her voice had changed. The warmth was gone. So that's your decision. Another pause. I wasn't trying to replace anyone. More silence. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "You can't push away someone who's already learned they aren't wanted." Something beneath my foot creaked. Margaret turned immediately. The moment she saw me standing there holding an empty glass, every trace of the conversation disappeared from her face. She smiled as though nothing unusual had happened. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked gently. Then she joked about how dull winters in Silver Lake were compared with summer, filled my glass, and walked me back upstairs with her hand resting lightly against my back. Neither of us mentioned that phone call again. At 13, I didn't understand the details. I only understood the feeling. Someone had tried to change my life. Someone else had refused. And whatever reason had been given hurt my aunt deeply. Like most children, I tucked the memory away, without knowing where it belonged. It would remain there for another decade before I finally learned exactly what Aunt Margaret had asked my mother that night, and why my mother had said no. There comes a point in every neglected child's life when hope quietly gives up asking. My parents mistook that silence for growing up. By the time I reached high school, everyone seemed impressed by how little attention I required. Teachers praised me for being responsible. Neighbors called me remarkably mature. My mother repeated those compliments whenever friends came over, wearing them as though they reflected her success as a parent. They misunderstood what they were seeing. It wasn't maturity. It was adaptation. I had learned that expecting nothing hurt less than being disappointed. A few months before my 15th birthday, I bought a plain spiral notebook from a discount store. Across the first page, I wrote one date in large letters. June 2018. That would be the month I finished high school. Everything I wrote after that revolved around one goal, leaving. The notebook became less of a journal and more of a blueprint for escape. I filled page after page with calculations. Average rent in towns I had never visited. How much groceries would cost if I cooked every meal myself? Gas prices. Used cars. How many hours I would need to work each week just to stay afloat. I treated every dollar like another mile between myself and the life I wanted to leave behind. Keeping plans to myself had become second nature. Silence was the one skill I had perfected. The summer I turned 17, I tested something. Instead of spending another season with Aunt Margaret, I asked if I could remain in town and find a summer job. My parents agreed almost immediately. They never wondered why. They never asked where I planned to work. They simply finished packing for their vacation in Cape Cod with Lucas. My mother proudly told everyone nearby, "Claire doesn't need us watching over her anymore." She meant it as praise. I heard something entirely different. Their trust wasn't confidence. It was indifference. That summer I worked double shifts at a small roadside cafe outside town. Every evening I counted my tips before going to bed. I wrapped the bills neatly with rubber bands and tucked them inside an old metal cookie tin hidden behind boxes of holiday decorations in my bedroom closet. Across the lid, I wrote one word with a black marker. Freedom. By graduation, the tin had been replaced by a small lockbox. Inside was just over $7,000. Not once did either of my parents ask why I was saving so much money. They assumed I was preparing for college. I never corrected them. Applications could be found. Acceptance letters could be opened. Questions could follow. So I planned my future somewhere no one paid attention to me, the quiet corner of our local public library. Nearly every Saturday, I spread maps across the table beside stacks of travel books. My search followed 3 simple rules. The town had to be far enough away that surprise visits were unrealistic. Living expenses had to be low enough for someone willing to start from the bottom. Most importantly, it needed bakeries looking for workers. Years beside Aunt Margaret had given me one valuable skill. I knew how to bake. Not as a hobby, as a trade. Week after week I searched. Nothing felt right. Then, one rainy afternoon, I opened a guidebook to a photograph of Traverse Bay, Montana. The water shimmered beneath the mountains with a familiar kind of peace. For a moment, it reminded me of the lake beside Aunt Margaret's bookstore. Only larger, wilder, like the life I wished I could have. I didn't spend hours weighing the decision. Something inside me settled the instant I saw it. Sometimes a place chooses you before you realize you've already said yes. I copied the addresses of several bakeries and coffee shops into my notebook. Using the mailing address of my best friend Emily, whose parents never questioned incoming mail, I quietly sent applications without telling anyone. Not even Aunt Margaret knew. Keeping that secret from her hurt more than anything else. But I understood my mother well enough to know what would happen after I disappeared. She would visit every person who cared about me. She would ask gentle questions with a calm smile. She would expect answers. I couldn't risk putting my aunt in that position. The safest secret was the one no one else carried. Near the end of May, Emily called me. One of the cafes had replied. They needed someone willing to wash dishes and help in the kitchen through the summer. The paycheck wasn't impressive. I accepted before finishing the letter. That night, I slept more peacefully than I had in years. Graduation arrived on a warm Saturday morning in June 2018. The ceremony took place on the football field beneath clear skies. Before sunrise, I was already awake. My old Toyota Corolla, purchased with money I'd earned myself, sat packed in the driveway. My red suitcase rested in the trunk. The lockbox of savings was hidden beneath the spare tire. Next to it lay one more box. Small, worn, filled with every postcard my parents had mailed during those forgotten summers. I had quietly taken them from Aunt Margaret's kitchen months earlier. At 18, I convinced myself I carried them because they proved something. Years later, I understood the truth. They weren't proof. They were scars I still couldn't bring myself to leave behind. My parents showed up for the ceremony. They smiled for photographs. They applauded when my name was called. They believed they knew exactly where I was going after graduation. They couldn't have been more wrong. One thing matters to me more than anything else when I tell this story. I want every detail to be truthful. Not because the truth changes what happened, but because it never needs exaggeration. My parents were there when the graduation ceremony began. They found their seats. They applauded for the students they recognized. Then, before my class was called, my mother leaned toward me with an apologetic smile. She explained that they couldn't stay until the end. Lucas had just accepted a new position in Cincinnati, and his company was hosting a welcome dinner that evening. If they waited any longer, highway traffic would make them late. She gave my hand a quick squeeze. "We're proud of you," she whispered. A few minutes later, they quietly walked away. When the announcer finally reached my section and called Claire Elizabeth Bennett, I crossed the stage alone. I accepted my diploma from someone I had never met before. Out of instinct, I searched the crowd. The 2 chairs where my parents had been sitting were empty. Only the folded ceremony programs remained. What surprised me wasn't the disappointment. That feeling had become familiar years earlier. Instead, I experienced something quieter. It felt like certainty, as though life had handed me the final answer to a question I had been asking since childhood. For years I worried that leaving without telling anyone would make me selfish. Standing on that stage, looking at those empty seats, that doubt disappeared. The decision had already been made for me long before I made one for myself. That evening I shared dinner with my parents as though nothing unusual had happened. We talked about ordinary things. I smiled when expected. Afterward, I excused myself, saying I was exhausted from the day's events. No one suspected a thing. Before dawn, while the entire house was asleep, I quietly carried my last bag outside. On the kitchen counter, I left a folded note beneath the ceramic cookie jar so it wouldn't be overlooked. I had rewritten that message dozens of times over the previous months. Every version became shorter than the one before it. Eventually, I realized the truth didn't require many words. The note simply read, "I'm safe. I'm old enough to make my own choices. Please don't try to find me." I signed only my first initial. That single letter carried a private meaning only Aunt Margaret would understand. Whether it was a farewell or a silent thank you, even now I'm not completely sure. I pushed my car out of the driveway before starting the engine. Only after I reached the end of the block did I switch on the headlights. Then I drove. For 3 days, the highway became my entire world. I slept inside my little Toyota Corolla in supermarket parking lots, keeping the doors locked and my savings hidden beneath the spare tire. Every mile placed another layer of distance between my old life and the one waiting ahead. While passing through Wyoming, I stopped at a quiet service station. There I removed the SIM card from my phone and replaced it with a prepaid one I had purchased weeks earlier using cash. The old card, the number my parents knew by heart, went into a trash bin before I pulled back onto the highway. By sunset on the third evening, I reached the final stretch of the journey. As my car climbed a winding hill, Traverse Bay, Montana, came into view below. Evergreen forests surrounded the lake. The water reflected the fading light so perfectly, it looked almost unreal. For a moment, I tightened my grip on the steering wheel because my hands had begun to tremble. Not from fear, from relief. I was 18 years old. Everything I owned fit inside one small car. No one, not my parents, not my friends, not even Aunt Margaret, knew where I had gone. Most people would probably describe that feeling as loneliness. To me, it felt like freedom, like breathing deeply after spending years underwater. 11 days after arriving, there was a knock on the door of the modest motel room I was renting. Before I even opened it, I knew exactly why someone had come. But before I tell you about the officer standing outside, you need to understand what my life already looked like by then. The cafe that had offered me a chance sat near the edge of the lake. Its name was Harbor Hearth Cafe. The building had been standing for decades, with worn wooden floors polished smooth by thousands of footsteps. The owner, Maria Alvarez, was 66 years old and believed every kitchen should run with discipline, precision, and respect. From my very first day, I spent long hours washing dishes, scrubbing pots, hauling supplies, and doing every task no one else wanted. By the end of each shift, my hands were dry, sore, and covered with tiny cuts. I didn't mind. Every ache belonged to a life I had chosen for myself. For the first time, every hour I worked was building my own future instead of waiting for someone else's approval. After a few weeks, I found a tiny apartment tucked above an old mechanic's garage. The rent was only $325 a month, and to me it felt like a palace simply because every key belonged to me. That first autumn brought an early freeze. One evening the heater stopped working. The apartment grew colder by the hour. I never called my landlord. Looking back, that decision explains more about my childhood than almost anything else. Instead, I walked to the public library, borrowed books on home repairs, watched every instructional video I could find, and bought a replacement part with money from my own pocket. The repair took an entire afternoon. I switched off the power, followed every step as carefully as I could, and somehow managed to bring the heater back to life. At the time, I congratulated myself for saving money. Years later, I understood the truth. It wasn't about saving a repair bill. It was about believing I wasn't allowed to ask anyone for help. That lesson had settled deep inside me long before I left home. Somewhere between those forgotten summers, I had convinced myself that needing another person was something to be ashamed of. I'd rather struggle in silence than risk becoming an inconvenience.
Remember that about me.
It became the weakness that shaped everything that happened afterward. Just before Thanksgiving, one of the bakery's pastry chefs injured her hand and couldn't work. During the afternoon rush, Maria stepped into the kitchen and looked around at everyone washing dishes and preparing vegetables. "Can anyone here make pastries?" she asked. Before my nerves had time to stop me, my hand was already in the air. She studied me for a second without saying anything. Then she handed me flour, butter, and a rolling pin. "Show me." I took a slow breath. My hands immediately remembered everything Aunt Margaret had taught me over the years. Without thinking, I worked the dough exactly as she had shown me countless times in the back room of her bookstore cafe. Maria watched every movement. When the crust came out of the oven, she cut herself a small piece. She chewed quietly. Then she looked back at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. "Who taught you that?" she asked. "My aunt." A smile spread across her face. "She didn't just teach you recipes," Maria said. "She taught you a profession." Then she walked away as though the conversation were over. I remained standing there, staring at that pie. For the first time in my life, a skill felt like an identity instead of an obligation. Now, let me return to the police officer who knocked on my motel door during those first weeks. He was much younger than I'd imagined. More importantly, he looked tired, like someone simply trying to finish another routine shift. My parents had reported me missing almost immediately after graduation. The report followed the few mistakes I'd made during my trip west, including using my debit card for fuel before I switched entirely to cash. That electronic trail had eventually led officers to me. I invited him inside. He asked for identification. I showed him my driver's license along with the lease I'd recently signed. He compared the documents, nodded once, and asked a single question. "Are you staying here because it's your own choice?" Yes. That was enough. He handed me a form confirming that I was an adult who had left voluntarily. After I signed it, he explained what would happen next. "My department will inform your family that you've been located and that you're safe," he said. "Your address and personal information remain private unless you decide otherwise." Then he wished me a good evening and left. It was over in minutes. The system my mother believed would return me home had instead protected my right to stay away. No amount of persuasion could change that. The law had drawn a line that no one else could cross. Before I replaced my phone number, one final voicemail managed to reach me. I listened to it once. My mother's voice filled the room. "Claire, this is getting ridiculous. We didn't raise you to behave like." I pressed delete before she finished. The silence that followed felt strangely peaceful. For the first time, I didn't have to hear the familiar lecture about being the child who never caused problems. That unfinished sentence became the last memory I carried of her voice for many years. Time passed. I settled into my routine. I built friendships. I earned promotions. Yet one small detail refused to change. The red suitcase still sat beside my bedroom closet exactly as it had on the day I arrived. I had unpacked my apartment. I had unpacked my kitchen. I had unpacked my life. But somehow I never unpacked that suitcase. Part of me still behaved as though someone might appear at any moment and tell me it was time to leave again. During my third autumn in Montana, I finally decided enough was enough. I unzipped the suitcase and emptied every last pocket. At the very bottom, I found a familiar cardboard box. Inside were all 10 postcards, each one carefully stacked in order, each one carrying the same cheerful handwriting. I carried the box outside behind the cafe, where an old metal drum was used for burning scrap paper. A lighter rested in my hand. For several minutes, I simply stood there. One spark would erase every reminder. But I couldn't do it. Not because I had forgiven the past. Because destroying them felt too much like disappearing all over again. Instead, I carried them back inside after closing. I sat alone at one of the empty tables with a pen. One by one, I turned every postcard over. Beneath my mother's cheerful message, I wrote the truth she had never included. Summer 4. This was the year I finally learned to swim because no one was watching long enough to stop me from trying. Summer 6. This was the year I smiled during goodbye because everyone liked me better when I didn't cry. Summer 9. This was the first time someone asked me what I wanted, and I realized I had no idea how to answer. By the time I finished, every postcard carried 2 stories. One described the vacation my family remembered. The other finally gave a voice to the childhood I had lived. The box eventually found a permanent place on the shelf above my kitchen cabinets. It wasn't hidden. I wanted to see it every day. For a long time, I convinced myself I was keeping those postcards as proof of what had happened. Deep down, that wasn't the real reason. Some small part of me still imagined that one day, someone would care enough to turn them over and read the story I had written on the back. By my 4th year in Traverse Bay, I was no longer just another employee at Harbor Hearth Cafe. Most customers knew me as the head baker. Whenever Maria's arthritis flared up, and it happened more often than she admitted, I managed the kitchen while she rested in the office with a cup of tea. One snowy afternoon, She invited me to sit with her after closing. She poured coffee into 2 chip mugs before getting straight to the point. "I've been thinking about slowing down," she said. She smiled toward the window where the empty garden beds waited for spring. "I'd rather spend my mornings planting tomatoes than standing over an oven." She explained that several buyers had approached her about purchasing the cafe. One was a regional restaurant company. Another wanted to replace the dining room with a trendy cocktail bar. She rolled her eyes. "I didn't spend 40 years building this place just to watch someone erase it." Then she looked directly at me. "I'd rather hand it to someone who understands why it matters." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she laid out her offer. "If you can put down $45,000, I'll finance the rest myself. We'll do it the old-fashioned way, monthly payments." The room suddenly felt much smaller. She wasn't offering me a job. She was offering me a future. That evening I went home, taped a large sheet of graph paper inside my closet door, and wrote one number across the top. $45,000. Below it, I carefully wrote the amount I had already saved. $24,180. Every payday after that became another step toward the same destination. I accepted every extra shift. I skipped unnecessary purchases. When my shoes wore out, I repaired them instead of buying new ones. Every few weeks, I erased the old total and wrote a larger one. The numbers slowly climbed. 27, 32, 38. People often describe buying a business as a financial decision. For me, it was something much deeper. It was the first dream I had ever allowed myself to believe might actually come true. I wasn't chasing a building. I was chasing permanence. A place where my name would belong. A place no one could decide I wasn't included. Before we ended that conversation, Maria added only one condition. She smiled gently and said, "Promise me you won't vanish one day." I laughed without thinking. She didn't. Some promises carry more weight than the person making them realizes. There was one connection to my old life I never completely let go of. Every June, during the week I had once been dropped off at Aunt Margaret's, I bought a postcard showing Traverse Bay's bright blue lake. I chose pictures that revealed nothing about where I actually lived. No landmarks. No street names. No return address. On the back, instead of writing a message, I drew a tiny loaf of bread. That little sketch had become our secret language. Then I mailed it to Aunt Margaret's bookstore. The first year, I stood outside the post office holding the postcard for nearly 15 minutes. Mailing it meant asking her to protect my secret without ever discussing it. I knew my mother would ask questions. I knew relatives would pressure her for answers. Yet I also knew I couldn't bear the thought of her believing I had disappeared forever. So, I dropped it into the mailbox. No words, only the drawing. She never replied. She couldn't. She had no idea where I was. But every summer I sent another postcard with another tiny loaf sketched in the corner. That became our entire conversation. For postcards. For drawings. Nothing else. She understood every one of them. No explanation was necessary. What I didn't realize until years later was how difficult that silence made every family gathering back home. By protecting me, she had quietly accepted every accusation and suspicious glance that came her way. She never complained. She never asked for anything in return. Some debts can't be measured in money. The magazine interview that changed everything wasn't even my idea. It was Maria's. For years I had lived by one simple rule. Stay unnoticed. The less attention I attracted, the safer I felt. Then a local lifestyle magazine began preparing a feature about businesses that had become part of the town's identity. Someone recommended Harbor Hearth Cafe because of our homemade bread and pastries. When the reporter asked to interview the owner, Maria pointed across the kitchen at me. "She's the reason people come back," she said. The journalist wanted my name, my photograph, a picture of me beside the ovens where I worked every morning. As cameras were unpacked and questions began, every instinct inside me screamed that something irreversible had just started.